Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. I'm your host, Brian Thomas Kropp, and I believe that stories have a tremendous power for good, and so I write them, and I enjoy sharing them with you. And if you are new to the show, I'm so glad that you are here. This is a show built around some of the stories that I have written, but not just to read you the story, but to also go into how those stories get made, and possibly not just from the clickety-clackety of the keyboard get made, but from the putting it together in formatting or cover design. But then all of my books have been self-published, which is why they're selling so well. They're self-published through Amazon, and so at some point we might get into talking about how to do that in case you are interested in self-publishing some of your own books. It is fun. It is detail-y, which I don't enjoy, and I've never published a book just easily the first time. It's always been like, oh, I forgot this and I forgot that. So we can talk about those adventures if that makes sense too. But right now we are reading chapters out of these books and then talking about what went into those chapters, maybe reveal a little family history or Easter eggs or some history, those kinds of things. And we've been in a story called Shell Game, which is part 2 of my Pearl saga. And you can check out book 1 called Showdown in the Yukon. It's in all the places over on Amazon. It's in all the places. Amazon. That's where it is. But Shell Game is a detective story. Showdown in the Yukon is not. So we're switching genres, but we're looking at Detective Evan Gold, who is in a small Kansas town and trying to solve a couple of murders, mostly because the police think he did them, and he's trying to prove that someone else did them. And he has also bounced across this strange pearl, and recently this pearl has revealed itself as not exactly a pearl, but it's really a woman. Her name is Lillian, and she is not from here. She is from somewhere else, and she's also fighting for her own survival and the survival of her people somewhere else, and has asked Evan if he will protect her and help her to save her world from some bad guys. So there's a little bit of a fantasy part of this story, but we still got these murders to solve. And so with this chapter, he runs into a couple of people who might be able to give him a little more help to find who committed these murders in town. So we will get into chapter 26 of Shell Game right after we hear from this week's sponsors. Chapter 26. Gold made his way from the Walnut Grove to the Webster. He noticed a familiar-looking woman tucked away in the corner of the lobby reading a book. Evan realized it was his friend Lauren Bacall. He tugged on the brim of his hat to shield his face a little and sauntered over to the front desk. Evan asked the attendant if Harold Huber was in. A quick check of the register said that he was not. "Thanks," Evan told the attendant and leaned his back against the counter. From across the lobby, he confirmed that Miss Bacall was indeed stationed in a far corner and walked to where she sat reading that morning's paper. He made himself comfortable in the chair across from hers and casually crossed his legs. If she noticed him, she gave no reaction. "Do you know where our man Harold is?" Evan asked, hoping to get a rise out of his competition. The woman's eyes darted to Evan without moving another muscle. "I don't know what you're talking about," she monotoned. "Sure you do," Evan said. "Likes to wear brown almost exclusively. Avant-garde hairstyle, I guess you'd call it. You know, Harold Huber. You saw him walk into my place last night." Evan adjusted his tie. Lauren bore daggers into Evan with her pupils. "Buzz off, buddy. You're playing way out of your league." Her attention returned to her reading. "I bet you're right," Evan said, taking his hat off and resting it on his knee. "But just which league is that, I wonder?" "Tell you what I wonder? I sometimes wonder if we're all even playing the same game. Hey, by the way," he said as he uncrossed his leg and leaned forward on his thighs, "you wouldn't happen to know a man by the name of Plum, would you? From somewhere in Colorado?" The woman folded the paper and slapped it on the side table. "Move along, mister, if you know what's good for you." "Or what?" Evan asked, amused. "Or, I screamed for you to take your meaty paws off me. Evan nodded and sighed. He smoothed his hair before placing his hat on his head. Well, we're going to have to talk sometime. Our paths have crossed too often already for that not to be an eventuality. Evan turned his gaze to the rest of the lobby's activity. He made like he was going to stand again, but stopped himself. Oh, and by the way, be sure to tell... At this, he placed his right hand over his right eye. That I say hello. Evan smiled like a successful mouser. The woman's countenance turned to ice, and she repeated, Buzz off, or I swear I'll scream bloody murder. Come on. Are you sure you don't know where Harold is? Evan poked again. You seem to be very aware of a lot of things. It's just odd that a man as clumsy as Harold would have slipped through your fingers. You're pressing your luck, mister, she said. Just then the hotel detective on duty stopped by to shake Evan's hand. Sorry about Gabe, he said. I don't mean to interrupt. I saw you over here and I had to offer my condolences. I'm just broken up about it. Evan stood to shake the man's hand. It comes for all of us sooner or later. Still, he said as he cocked his glance over to the woman, you have to wonder what darkness goes on in a person's heart to kill someone in cold blood. The detective nodded. Evan turned his attention back to the detective. Say, Mike, just a question, friend to friend, but have you lowered your standards around here? The detective gave Evan a curious look. What's going on? I didn't know when you allowed women of such obvious loose moral character to loiter in your lobby. The woman's face flushed scarlet, and she once again turned up her newspaper. The detective looked at her and asked, What's your business here, miss? But before she could answer, Evan said, You might want to check her coat. She might be carrying a firearm or two in there. Mike looked over to Evan and then to the woman. All right, he signaled her to stand. Empty your pockets in the table. The woman complied with the detective's instructions, all the while drawing her lips into a tight line. Sure enough, the only thing to come out of the pockets was a well-oiled revolver. You got a license for that? The detective asked. The woman nodded and produced the necessary papers. The detective examined them, and once he saw that everything was in order, he handed back the license and said, Why don't you pack up and move along, miss? If I see you back here, you better have a respectable reason. The woman stuffed the gun back in her pocket, picked up her paper, and looked like she was about to claw great gouges into Evan's face. She restrained herself, and she left the hotel without further incident. When she was gone, Evan turned to Evan. What was that all about? I don't know, he said. Well, not exactly. Anyway, thanks, Mike. What brings you down here? Mike asked. Seems I've misplaced a guest of yours. Harold Huber. Seen him? The register says he's not in. Mike nodded. Believe me, if he was in, we'd know it. It's like he's trying so hard not to be noticed that he lights up like a neon sign on a foggy night. Speaking of fog, can you believe this? The detective pointed out a nearby window. The fog was thin enough to see across the street, but still covered any blue in the sky that might be up there. Weirdest weather I can remember, Evan said. I don't like it, the detective said. Reminds me of one of those Twilight Zone shows. Never seen it. I don't recommend it, especially not right before bed. It'll give you the creeps. I get enough of that in my day job, Evan chuckled. Anyway, what can you tell me about him? Huber, I mean, Evan asked. Not much. Peculiar fellow. Lots of requests for house staff and the like, but nothing over the line. Been here 4 days, maybe 5. Any strange stories from housekeeping? Mike frowned and shook his head. Can you tell me if he's been in at all since last night? Evan asked. I can check my book, Mike said and motioned Evan to follow him to his office. Mike flipped the pages on a ledger book on his desk and ran his fingers down the narrowly lined rows. I have him dropping off his keys at 7, but he hasn't been back to pick it up. Mike looked up from his ledger. Something I should know about, Evan? This time Evan frowned and shook his head. Nah, he said, just keeping my eye on him. As you say, don't know much about him. Trying to see what I can see, you know? Mike nodded. Need me to keep an eye on him? Maybe do some digging? Evan shrugged. Can't hurt. You know how it is these days. You can never be too careful. You think he's a communist? You know the Cubans, Mike started. Evan chuckled. I don't think it's anything like that. Probably more a run-of-the-mill kind of situation. Thanks for watching out, Mike. I owe you one. Evan shook the detective's hand. I sure owe you more than one, Mike laughed. Again, I'm real sorry what happened to Gabe. Evan stepped out of the detective's office and had not made it halfway across the lobby when he saw Harold enter through the front door. Harold looked like several miles of bad road, though he tried to disguise it with a show of poise. His cheek had a bandage on it from where Claire had pistol-whipped him, and his face indicated it was in desperate need of sleep and several hours in a dark room. "Harold!" Evan shouted, and Harold winced under the volume. He turned and smiled weakly at Evan and said, Good morning, Mr. Gold. I'm sure you want to chat, but I'm just getting in from last night's, adventure. I would very much not like to see visitors for several hours if I can avoid it. Certainly of all people, you can understand." "I'm sure I can," Evan said, slapping Harold on the back. "I wondered, though, if there would be a place where you and I could speak, privately." It visibly pained Harold to shake his head, but said, "I'm sure that would have a certain interest for me, but my private encounters with you as of late have been less than pleasant." At this, Harold touched his bandage lightly with his fingertips. "Yeah, I'm sorry about that. You know how women can get," Evan shrugged, guiding Harold over to some lobby chairs. "But we had to put on a good show for the police. You understand." "I understand that you and Miss Porter invited me over to get information that I don't have." "What's that mean?" Evan asked. Harold lowered his voice so as not to attract any more attention. "It means you know where the pearl is, and you're toying with me. I don't know what you hope to gain by your tactics. My employer's offer is quite generous." Evan felt a surge of adrenaline at the mention of the pearl, but kept his focus on Harold. Maybe he'd been found out. He couldn't imagine how, and needed to keep pretending like he didn't know anything about it. "I'm sure it is," Evan said, "but I don't exactly have the pearl. Not in my immediate possession." Harold's face dropped, and he clenched his teeth together. "But you said—" "I said I know where it is, which I agree is also misleading." He could see the panic grew on Harold's face. "Calm down, Harold. Miss Porter does," Evan said, "and at this point, I'm willing to believe her. All I have to do is get her to cough up the location and we're in business." Harold scoffed and said, "You always have a smooth answer for everything, don't you, Mr. Gold? It would be amazing anyone believes a word that comes out of your mouth." Evan smiled. "Can't we all admit each of us is holding on to cards he doesn't want the other to know about?" "Fine," said Harold as he turned to leave Evan. "How'd you get on with Short and Abrams last night?" Evan asked, which stopped Harold's escape. "Did they take you over to the station?" Harold sneered. "Yes. We had a lovely time, thank you." "How long they keep you?" "Till just now. I was heading back to my room to lie down. It's been a very long day already." Harold again turned to leave. "What did you tell him?" Harold turned back. "Nothing. You can rest assured my interests are the same as yours. The further the police stay ignorant of what is going on, the better." "Are you sure you told them nothing?" Evan asked. "This, I assure you, Mr. Gold, was not my first interrogation. I know how to keep my wits about me." "Good," Evan said. "Let's keep it that way. I know those two. They're like bloodhounds. There's something in the air and they can smell it. It's a safe bet they're likely to come back around sniffing for more information before this is all over. But I wouldn't worry too much." Once again, Evan slapped Harold on the back. "Anyway, you should get some shut-eye. You look terrible. I'm sure I'll find you again when I know something new." Harold made a weak smile and meandered to the desk to pick up his room key before ascending the stairs. Evan rubbed his chin, checked his watch, and the strange tattoo on his palm once again caught his eye. He caressed the mark with his thumb and watched the light pulse across its surface before hiding his hand in his pocket. Evan looked around to see if anyone was paying him special attention, and when he saw that he was in the clear, began his way back out of the hotel. So after the kind of otherworldliness of Chapter 25, Chapter 26 is sort of bizarre in my mind because it's this return to normalcy. If normal is possible in this book, this is where the return to normal. He has deposited Claire back at her apartment. The Pearl has talked to him and made herself visible to him as Lillian, the princess of the Coelum in some other land, some other place. And he is still trying to figure out who solved these murders. So he goes back to see if maybe Harold, if he can touch base with Harold, and runs into Lauren and all these things. So it's sort of, we're back into the crime part and away from the fantasy part of the story. But what is interesting to me, particularly in re-listening to this one, there are things about this chapter that when it's made into an audiobook, and one of the benefits of this podcast is that it puts me in a place where I can make the audiobooks for these stories. It's weird the way my brain works. If you sat down with me and said, okay, we need an audiobook for this thing, I would mark out a bunch of stuff on my calendar and figure out how to do that. And it would take up a bunch of time, and I would feel stressed out because I'm not writing or doing other things that I would like to do to keep moving the making of these books move forward. It would seem like a giant pause. However, one of the reasons that I do this podcast is because I want as many people as possible to hear the stories. And I think if all I did was write books, there's something about that phrase, you don't judge a book by the cover, that all people see is the cover. And most of the people as far as I know, a lot of the people who have bought my books, and possibly the people who listen to the show, are people I personally know. And which is great if you know me and then like, oh, well, my friend wrote a book, so I will check out the book. I don't know if it's going to be any good or not, but maybe. And then if you say to one of your friends, hey, a friend of mine wrote a book, they're all going to say, well, it's probably junk, so no, I'm not going to buy that book at all. So somehow you've got to get past my friends, and if you're one of my friends, your friends, you have to get past those people, the people who don't know me at all, who go, oh, that's a really good book. And the podcast, hopefully, is one of those places where you can get past the cover and find out whether or not the book is any good, even if the cover looks really nice, which I'm not saying mine do, but hopefully they look nice enough to be like, I wonder what's going on in that little book. So anyway, that's one of the reasons for the podcast. But a side benefit of that is, reading it chapter by chapter, you end up with an audio version of the book that you can put out on Audible. But it comes with its own problems that I often am not thinking about when I'm writing the book, because I'm thinking, oh, it's going to live in ink on paper or pixels on a Kindle or something like that. I'm not thinking so much about how does it read out loud. I think I'd first gotten into writing Fish Tales, which was an episode about a year ago, writing these kids' book, and I'm just writing the way I write. And a friend of mine said, so are you writing these for kids to read, or are you writing them for parents to read them to the kid? Like, oh, I didn't even think about that. Kids can't read my sentences. But that was very good counsel. And so that's also one of the reasons I've shied away from kids' books since then, because I don't know that I write for kids all that well. I've read lots of kids' books to my kids. And I don't know that I could write that sentence. I would use way too many words, and they'd be more vocabulary. And anyway, so when I'm sitting down to write, I'm not thinking about what voice people have, unless it's particular. Like Max Sutherland in Showdown in the Yukon, I had his voice in my head, and that informed a lot of how he said what I wrote that he said. When I wrote For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, I had a voice, a dialect in my head for that, and that's why it has the very Victorian tone that it has. For Harold Huber, there was a style of voice that I had in mind, and that sort of informed how he wrote or how he talked. I did not have that for Lauren Bacall at all. I was just writing down words. Frankly, I didn't have that for Evan or Sophie or Claire or like most of the characters. I didn't have a dialect or an accent or a tone in my head for them. And now I'm recording them for audio, and I'm like, oh no, what do I do? And who's Mike? And all these kinds of crazy things. So please forgive me. I don't know how to do, I liked that the heavy character, and I don't mean like large boned. I mean, like in old gangster films or crime noirs, there's this bad person who was called the heavy, or like the club bouncer type person. I don't know how to write that as a very petite and almost Hollywood-esque looking woman. So forgive me for the voice, was what came to mind when I was recording this. And then there's Mike, who talks like this for some reason. I don't know why. I decided for all of these voices, I was going to go to New York and drag some people from New York, possibly from the 1930s James Cagney gangster movies, and plop them in the middle of 1960s Kansas, but that's kind of what's going on. There are a couple of other references. One of the things that I really wanted to drive home, and I don't know that I did it all that well, in my mind, one of the inspirations for this story is stories like The Maltese Falcon and those kind of darker noir films, and they're all black and white, and they are all sort of in a time window. I mean, there's Chinatown and there's other films that were made outside of this particular window of like the 1920s, 1940s era of the United States. But most of those stories, even if they were made today, they would still take place in that historical time period. And I wanted a noir that wasn't stuck in like a pre-World War II world. So I'm trying, how can I shove this thing into the early 60s as hard as I can? And so The Twilight Zone was on television at the time, and so that would be a current thing. And television was kind of new-ish. I guess it'd been around for about 10 years. And if you haven't seen The Twilight Zone, I can't say that I've seen a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, but they are all kind of in a pseudo science fiction, but mostly mind-bendy kind of way, where there might be Martians living next door to you, or your neighbor vanishes for no good reason, or there really is a gremlin hanging off the plane that you're flying on, or like there's these really weird stories. And I think it played late at night on television, and it literally is not the kind of show you want to. It just messes with your mind just enough. It's not a horror story. It's not gross, but it messes with your mind just enough that you probably don't want to go to sleep right after it. But that was kind of to set it in early 60s. But then also there's another reference to sort of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Mike wondering if this gal that we're calling Lauren Bacall for the moment, if she is a communist, and, what is, because the Cubans. And earlier in the book, Sophie, who is Evan's receptionist secretary, had been reading the paper, and that was a story in one of the papers that there are these soccer fields that are curious to people in the government, and I doubt that ever made it into the newspaper at the time. But the way, as far as I understand, the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were some CIA pictures of some Cuban soccer fields that didn't quite look right, and that turned out to be that the Russians had sent over some, or I don't know if they had sent or were planning to send and getting things ready for sending some nuclear missiles over to Cuba to potentially launch at the United States, or at least hold us at bay from launching them at Russia during the Cold War. But so all of that is kind of kicking up and brewing at the time. I think late, like say September, October of 1962, all this is going on. So that was just a really lame attempt to lock this thing into 1962. The other thing that I did enjoy when I was writing it, I enjoyed recording it and I enjoy listening to it, is just the interplay between Harold and Evan. They're two very different people. Harold is clearly irritated by most things Evan does, and Evan is just loving the daylights out of irritating Harold. It was both fun to write and listen to. So those are fun things for me. And I think if you are writing a book or a story, you should find the things in there that you enjoy because you're the first audience. So I think with every chapter, find something that you want to play with and have fun with, because I think some of that, the joy that you have in the writing of the words, comes out into how it plays and how people respond to it. So take that nugget of wisdom and do with it what you will. That's what I have for the show today. And if you have enjoyed your time here, I would enjoy you swinging over to wherever you're listening to this and leave an honest rating and review. If you want to see how far past my friends and your friends Shell Game can go, you can go over to Amazon.com and leave a rating and a review for a Shell Game or any of my other books over there. That does help get strangers to know about the books. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about what's going on in the world of Brian Thomas Kropp, you can swing over to brianthomaskropp.com and sign up for the readers group and find out all about things there. Let's see, anything else? Nope. I think that's it for this week. I hope that you have a great week, and we will see you back here next time.